Aboriginal women live, migrant communities and so on. So we'll seek that invitation with that community and find 2 to 3 to 5 female leaders that want to be able to form a group. And the Grameen model is unique in that we don't take any physical collateral, but develop what's called social collateral, where a group feels allegiance to each other, support with each other, that the business ideas of those 5 women will be presented and with a cash flow analysis, marketing analysis, risk analysis, logistics capability, and all common basic business principles. And we will then say, well, okay, what do you need for working capital, to buy fixed capital items like sewing machines, weaving looms, whatever it may be that's required to start the business, and provide a small loan of maybe $5,000 or $10,000 repayable, repayments matched to when the income's expected to be realised, and with repayments every fortnight. But we encourage the clients, the groups, to come together every fortnight to share their experience, to share that connection and share what's worked. And this is really the best of community-led, strength-based economic development. And this is what we're all yearning for in the world right now, Leon, this human connectedness and willingness for others to back each other and support each other as we move forward.
And the money itself is actually very small scale. I mean, we're talking small capital here, aren't we?
We are, yes. So loans of $5,000, $10,000 at an interest rate of maybe 10 or 12%. That's negligible, really, when you're repaying it over a shorter period of time, but it's an annual interest rate, but will be an effective interest cost of maybe 4 or 5%. What we've seen all around the world, particularly in the States, is a 99% repayment rate for these loans that are being advanced. But more importantly, we're seeing a transformation of confidence, of dignity, of control and economic security, and that's in everyone's interest. But we also know, particularly, that female micro entrepreneurs reinvest income that they make through their business in very socially productive pursuits. So in the family, through nutritious food, education, and other development, health and other development within the household. And that has a significant economic sort of trickle through and ripple effect that is very, very compelling to economists and health professionals alike.
And of course, what you're doing is you're actually building communities by doing that, aren't you?
We are. This is one of the great things. And our founder, Professor Muhammad Yunus, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2006. He's a former World Bank economist who literally was approached by a woman in a village. He wasn't sure whether she was asking for charity or for a grant, but she said, no, if you can give me enough money to buy materials that I can convert and value add during the day. He provided that small loan, but he didn't think about it. He saw the woman later that afternoon, after she'd been to the market, sold all of her produce, and he got back not only the amount that he only wanted, his amount back, but she said, no, I insist in giving you an extra 20% for your trust and faith in me. And that transmission of human to human trust, both from the borrower and the lender, is something very, very profound that we all need in the world, especially today when we see the economic model being turned on its head, large corporations not being able to give the certainty that they were able to once.
Now, you of course are targeting women, but also you mentioned Aboriginal and migrant communities, and you can be doing work with them as well. Is that right?
That's right. Well, this collective model of peer-based lending really lends itself well to work within Aboriginal culture, where there is a strong loyalty and attachment to clan and to community. So it really complements the existing community structure and clan identity. Equally, in migrant communities around Australia and around the world, we've seen this model become very successful, where in a group there may be, for example, an Australian migrant that has maybe a Vietnamese background, a Sudanese background, Lebanese background, all meeting together and sharing their business ideas and stories. And what it also does, as you say, it really does bring communities together, demystifies what people from other cultures, where in this increasingly divided world, it brings people together to understand, to share stories, to work together, and for all of us to see each other as people, human beings, simply aspiring to live with each other and to relate well with each other.
Now, what's exciting about this is potentially it can create a whole lot of social entrepreneurial businesses, can't it?
It can. Coronavirus has caused the economic machine to sleep, and let's be very careful about how we go back to or create a world that we all aspire to. That this rampant pursuit of profit maximisation through capitalism is something we need to rein in and find within reason. So we're encouraging the businesses to do whatever they want with their income and their retained earnings, but we know many of the businesses want to model their own economic structure on Grameen as an organisation, as a social business, investing surpluses back to reach more and more people. So to the extent that we can do that, that's something that we encourage. So cafes, restaurants, textile businesses that are all investing to grow and bring more and more people into that enterprise. And really, that's grassroots, community-led. Community know best about how to support those that need it most in the community. And that's an absolute aim of this program. That's right, Leon.
So how's the response been to Grameen so far?
Overwhelmingly positive. We've only really let people know over the last month about our plans. In the last month, we've had approaches from large banks, insurance companies, professional services firms, federal and state governments we're talking to right now about catalytic grants to get us up and running. We also have some philanthropic investors that have seen the Grameen model work overseas, who value the importance and aspirations of women in our economy. So overwhelmingly positive. We're actually looking at starting pilot programs in places like Broadmeadows, Heidelberg, Footscray, Wyndham, where there are large overlaps with our target client group in Victoria, but also in New South Wales, places like Fairfield, Queensland, in Inala, remote communities in the Northern Territory and East Arnhem Land have all been approaching us and saying, this is something that resonates with me and my worldview, and I really want to be part of it to either support or to connect my clients to this wonderful and successful initiative that's worked well overseas.
Well, what the great irony is that COVID-19 could have given you a great push along in this.
That's exactly right. It has been an accelerator, a catalyst for acceleration. There's no doubt about that. And particularly when we see large, significant, unexpected unemployment and this disjointed workforce that, of course, we all want certainty, we all want stability, but in a world where we're increasingly having to make our own path and do it in a way with our own values. I think this model is the Grameen model. It really does help people to bring that to life. And again, it's a great investable opportunity for government, where we're seeing large numbers of people coming out of an organised workforce into an informal workforce with skills, with characteristics, with market knowledge of their own community, being able to apply that market knowledge. And that brings not only economic opportunity and reinvestment, and it also avoids income support for government to continue to pay JobKeeper and JobSeeker as the government aims to taper those investments off over time. They are there to provide a foundation for people to become economically active again. And I think this is that exact opportunity that government's looking for, to be present in many communities, to have those small loans, to buy the equipment, to get the training and the mentoring. The simple act, Leon, of the loans themselves to micro entrepreneurs being used in a stimulatory way to buy office equipment, to buy fixed equipment, to buy embroidery, digitising, fishing boats, whatever the vocation may be, will be a significant economic stimulus provided by investment by others to match governments who might support sort of catalytic grants, and local councils supporting catalytic grants in each local community that we're aiming to move into.
Well, it'll be fascinating to watch, and good on you, Adam, and we'll be watching it very closely, and congratulations for setting it up.
Thanks so much, Leon. I really appreciate your support.
And now let's talk to economist Nicholas Gruen.
Well, Nicholas Gruen, the Productivity Commission has just put out a report proposing an Indigenous evaluation strategy. What is it, and what is its significance?
So governments, as we all know, have got lots of problems with Indigenous policies. We spend many tens of $1,000s per Indigenous person of government outlays, and Indigenous disadvantage continues rumbling on. Government policies are kind of famously unsatisfactory, and governments commit to Indigenous policies, and then is given that the programs don't work, their latest fad, I'll call it, although there's some good things to be said for it, which has been going for 4 or 5 years now, is to say that really we need to be much more evidence-based in our policy, and so we should have a lot more evaluation. There is $40 million over 4 years being made available for evaluation of Indigenous programs, and the Productivity Commission was given the job of coming up with what could sound more sensible than an Indigenous evaluation strategy. So the draft of that has just come out, and that's where we're at the moment.
Yes, but you're much more sceptical about it. When writing about Indigenous policy, you refer to Lord Acton's fault line. Would you care to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've used this, it's a joke. The joke is from Lord Acton, and Gough Whitlam used to quote it. And Lord Acton said, I think around about the turn of the 20th century, that rowing was the perfect preparation for public life because it enabled you to face in one direction while you travel in the other. And I've thrown that joke in as an aside for, in my writing about government for about 20 years. And when in an essay that's about to be published on Inside Story on Indigenous evaluation, I decided that that was a mistake, and that in fact Lord Acton's fault line should be this gap between what we say and what we do, what governments say and what they do, should be made completely central to the analysis, not a throwaway line. And let me give you some examples. Governments are constantly announcing that they will cut over regulation. Well, how's that going? So what they do is they set up a Lord Acton regime, if you like, and they have a regime, and they'll have regulators will have to go through regulatory impact statements. They're facing in one direction, and the direction they're facing in is to tackle over regulation. But every time a particular regulation turns up, the government departments tick all the boxes in the regulatory impact statements, and the regulatory impact statements turn into a farce. Another example is freedom of information legislation. I'm not against freedom of information regulation or legislation. It has done some good, but the problem is that every time you face in the direction of freedom of information, there are all kinds of mechanisms in the system. Firstly, you can more or less pretend to do it, and the legislation doesn't have any teeth. But if the legislation does have teeth, then conversations go offline, and all kinds of second round effects occur, so that the government can be seen to embrace freedom of information, but in fact this goal recedes further into the distance. And that's one of the things that's going on in Indigenous policy.
So governments say one thing, but they actually do another. How does that work in Indigenous policy?
Well, you might remember the Northern Territory intervention announced by John Howard 6 months before the 2007 election. It certainly looked like an election stunt to me. It certainly did to the Aboriginal community. We had the Army in, we had the Racial Discrimination Act waived for the duration of the policy. And now you can argue that extreme measures were called for. The dramatic thing was that the extreme measures were cooked up over not much more than a weekend by the Prime Minister and his minister, and I no doubt a few senior ministers, and they were highly unsatisfactory. Now, this was a Prime Minister, John Howard, who talked about practical reconciliation and said his real commitment wasn't to all this symbolic stuff, but it was to improving Aboriginal lives. The words and the actions didn't line up. More recently, Malcolm Turnbull, shortly after coming into government, said he was an evidence guy. He said, why would you pursue a policy that isn't backed by the evidence? And fairly shortly afterwards, started talking about income management in Aboriginal communities. Now, income management, most of your listeners will know, is a policy in which if an Aboriginal person, or if the target of the policy receives a dole payment, a large part of that is corralled it has to be made on acceptable expenses, groceries and so on. And the idea is to prevent this turning up in purchases of drugs and alcohol. It sounds like a good policy. That's why it's good retail politics. But it happens to be one of the policies that has been extensively tested. And the evaluations tell you that it isn't very satisfactory. It has some small benefits, it has some costs, some of those are large, it demoralizes communities, and there is a small role for it, it seems, particularly kind of where you would expect, where communities or families actually ask for it. But that isn't how we do it. And this isn't just at the political level. There's constant reference to following the evidence, but if you actually look at what happens, that isn't what happened.
Right, okay. So the government is now focusing on the importance of evaluation, but you're sceptical. What's the problem?
Well, again, in the area of evaluation, look a little more carefully. Evaluation was an important part of ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission that was abolished towards the end of the Howard years. I'm not here to say ATSIC was a good or a bad thing. I don't actually know enough about it. What I do know, that ATSIC ran a substantial evaluation operation, and when ATSIC was closed down, it was shunted off, I think, to the Department of Finance for a while and fell into abeyance. That was something that our bureaucrats probably could have prevented, but it was our bureaucrats who started talking about how important it was for this whole story, for Aboriginal policy to be evidence-based. And then they tell us that it'll be evidence-based if we just do more evaluation. Now, that's another situation where you look for Lord Acton. If it doesn't work within what you might have thought was a relatively easier area like regulation review, where we have various requirements that regulations are evaluated before we go ahead with them, and those don't work. That regime does not work to make regulation particularly evidence-based. Why would we expect that to happen with evaluation? Now, the Productivity Commission, which has been reporting on Indigenous disadvantage through the Close the Gap program for about a decade, their draft strategy argues for evaluation to be independent and for evaluation to be published. Sounds great. But the thing is that this independence ends up taking a form which is extremely like regulation review. That is, there is a little independent agency that oversights evaluation, but the evaluation itself will be commissioned by or done by the departments, the line departments that run the programs. So they have a great deal of influence over the people who are evaluating what they do. So we're sort of replicating this structure that doesn't work, and it doesn't work because it enables people to face in one direction while travelling in the other direction.
Very much Lord Acton and very much a Clayton's independence. I mean, you've proposed an alternative model, the Evaluator General, about which we've talked before. Can you explain what it is and how it would develop, how it would help?
It's a long story, the Evaluator General, but my idea is that simply imposing independence on evaluation is going to create such conflicts between the agencies delivering programs and the agencies evaluating them that I'm not at all confident that that model will work. And what I've tried to do is to build something which in some ways resembles, or is part of my thinking, the inspiration for this was the production line at Toyota, which sounds like a pretty strange thing to say. And the thing about Toyota is that what Toyota did now, several decades ago, was to realize that the way to get productivity in a plant wasn't to have senior people imposing evaluation on junior people, because what would happen is something like Lord Acton's problem, that you create all these conflicts of interest. The point is that people at the top rely on people at the bottom for the information that they give them, so they can't at the same time hold them accountable in that highly adversarial way. And what the Toyota production system does is it begins with the presumption that teams of people want to do a good job, not a bad job. They'd actually prefer to improve their productivity so long as it isn't simply working harder and harder and harder and harder. And so what Toyota did was they spent literally 10 times the amount of resources training their workforce, and they gave their workforce all kinds of tools and knowledge to enable them to measure their own performance and to optimize it, and then to go and see other teams elsewhere in the factory and jointly optimize their performance where they had some sort of interdependence. Now, the Evaluator General is not a top-down mechanism like an Auditor General, which checks up on people and makes sure that things have been done in a compliant way. What an Evaluator General does is it has an independent evaluator. It introduces a kind of, a structural separation between evaluating what's happening and doing it. There needs to be close collaboration between both of those functions, but it's a bottom-up process. And the idea is that people out in the field are given the tools to improve their performance and measure their performance in order to improve it. If you can do that, and if you can harness their own desire to do a good job, and most people involved in these programs do want to do a good job, then you can build up from there, up to the top, with a structure of information and reporting that has integrity and huge improvements in the efficacy of these programs as people find little ways to improve what they're doing.
Well, that would be a much smarter approach, because you would actually get things done.
You would get things done, and it is completely extraordinary what Toyota did with labour productivity on the line. Now, it sounds like a funny thing to talk about labour productivity when we're talking about Indigenous disadvantage, but we're trying to make complex programs work, and Toyota improved labour productivity. It beat labour productivity in other factories by a factor of 4. In other words, the programs we have are highly dysfunctional. I think they could be made much more functional, and that would generate huge amounts of more bang for each of the bucks that we put into Aboriginal programs.
Well, Nicholas Gruen, those are very wise words and very fascinating concept, and let's hope it's taken up. And thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much, Leon.
So what's happening in the news? Well, investors should position for the rising odds of President Donald Trump winning re-election, according to JP Morgan Chase. Betting odds that earlier had Trump well behind challenger Joe Biden are now nearly even, largely due to the impact on public opinion of violence around protests, as well as potential bias in polls, says strategist Marko Kolanovic. Based on past research, there could be a shift of 5 to 10 points in polls from Democrats to Republicans if the perception of protests turns from peaceful to violence, he said. People giving inaccurate answers could artificially skew polls in favour of Biden by 5 to 6%, he added. And Australia is officially in its first recession for almost 3 decades, with the June quarter GDP numbers showing the economy went backwards by 7%, the worst fall on record, and a second straight contraction. The quarterly slump is worse than the Great Depression, with annual growth now the lowest since World War II, after shrinking to negative 6.3% from 1.4% in the March quarter, official Australian Bureau of Statistics figures show. The June quarter contraction follows a 0.3% fall in the March quarter, locking in 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth required for a technical recession. The June quarter hit was worse than the market's economists' expectations of a 6% fall in the quarter and a 5.2% fall annually. Household consumption growth collapsed minus 12.1% in the quarter, down further from minus 1.1% fall in the March quarter, and now pulls annual consumption growth down to negative 12.7%. The fall in consumption, which makes up about 60% of GDP, was driven by a 17.6% fall in services consumption for the June quarter due to the introduction of COVID-19 restrictions. Total private business investment contracted 6.5%, down further from 0.8% contraction in the March quarter, and is now down 7.6% for the year. And official figures from the Australian Bureau of Statistics showed exports of services fell 18.4% in the June quarter, but services imports collapsed 49%. And the Reserve Bank has kept official interest rates unchanged at a record low of 0.25%, but expanded a scheme that allows banks to secure cheap funding to $200 billion until June next year. The central bank also gave further indications it would take further action on monetary easing if required, and that a recovery in employment would be some months away. And Australian house prices fell for a fourth consecutive month in August as a slump in the Melbourne market, the centre of a renewed COVID-19 outbreak, weighed heavily on the national picture, and expected higher unemployment continues to cloud the outlook. Property values in major cities dropped 0.5% last month. CoreLogic data released Tuesday showed. Prices in Melbourne slumped 1.2%, with the city's 5 million residents having endured around 2 months of lockdown conditions to contain the spread of the coronavirus. Through the course of the pandemic, Melbourne has fallen 4.6%. In Sydney and Brisbane, the rate of decline eased, while prices held up or improved in other major cities, reflecting the link between market performance and the severity of social distancing policies, according to Tim Lawless, head of research at CoreLogic. Sydney's decline cooled to 0.5% from 0.9% in July, and Lawless warns we could start to see the rate of decline becoming a little bit worse. And household spending in Victoria has slumped more than 30% since late June, and the Morrison government expects more Victorians will soon be on JobKeeper than the rest of the country combined. The number of Victorians on unemployment benefits has also skyrocketed, up by almost 28,000 people since the beginning of the second lockdown, with more than half signing on the first 3 weeks of August. The devastation of Victoria's second coronavirus wave was laid bare in new Commonwealth Treasury analysis, which shows the full extent of Australia's two-speed recovery and reveals Victoria's being left behind. The analysis showed while all states were showing similar improvements between April and late June, the number of Victorians on unemployment benefits had since increased by 7.2%, while household spending had plummeted 30%, led by a 45% fall in discretionary spending. And Victorians have predictably closed their wallets in lockdown, with the state logging a 22% plunge in overall consumer spending compared to before the pandemic. The spending slump is pronounced in Victoria, with overall spending down by just 5% nationwide and only 3% in New South Wales. Victorian cafes have been hit particularly hard, with spending down 42% in the sector. In New South Wales, cafe spending in late August actually increased. Fashion and leisure spending also plunged in Victoria, down 54% on normal levels compared to the 25% increase in New South Wales. And the pandemic has gutted local movie houses, with cinemas in the ACT, Adelaide and Perth all having shut for good in recent months. Like many other sectors, the industry's 15,000 Australian employees have found themselves largely reliant on JobKeeper subsidies. But as blockbuster films begin to slowly trickle out for global release, Melbourne cinemas remain shut and Sydney theatres are limited to 25% capacity. The industry now takes in just 10 to 15% of typical income. And the acquisition by IOOF of NAB's wealth management arm, MLC, brings to an end one of the most sordid periods in Australian corporate and political history, one in which the biggest and most important companies in Australia systematically ripped off their customers, all while politicians defended them. The major bank's retreat from the wealth management sector is in the news after wealth group IOOF agreed to snap up National Australia Bank's MLC division in a deal pegged at up to $1.5 billion. The acquisition of National Australia Bank's superannuation advice business, MLC Wealth, will mean Australia's 4 biggest banks have finally jettisoned the financial advice business that damaged their reputations and cost them billions in customer remediation. And the first of the tech giants has called the bluff equally of the federal government and old media, with Facebook announcing it will stop allowing Australian publishers and users from sharing local and international news on Facebook and Instagram if a proposed code requiring Facebook Pay for news posts becomes law. Facebook will also exclude Australia from the rollout of the platform's News tab, which has already seen payments to participating publishers including in the US, News Corp. Treasurer Josh Frydenberg hit back at Facebook for suggesting the news boycott, while Cabinet colleagues dismissed the threat and vowed to proceed with a mandatory code by the end of the year. And Parliament has signed off an extension to the $100 billion JobKeeper scheme, meaning recipients will begin receiving a lower rate at the end of the month. The payment of $1,500 a fortnight is set to drop, and if you're on JobSeeker, you should also expect a decrease in your payments. From September 28, the payment will fall to $1,200 a fortnight, followed by a further drop at the beginning of January 2021 to $1,000. But that's only if you're working at least 20 hours a week before JobKeeper is introduced. If you're a part-timer, then your payment will fall to $750 a week from the end of the month, then to $650 a week at the start of next year. All extensions are due to expire on March 28, 2021. The changes are due to come into effect in less than 4 weeks' time, despite the fact that Melbourne is currently still under strict lockdown. The government estimates that from October onwards, more people will be on JobKeeper in Victoria than the rest of the country combined. Since March, the $550 a fortnight JobSeeker payment, a rebranded New Start allowance, has been effectively doubled to $1,100 a fortnight with the introduction of the coronavirus supplement. But from September 25, the supplement will fall to $250 a fortnight, taking the total JobSeeker payment to just over $800 a fortnight. And while we're on the topic of JobKeeper, this week we had revelations that companies on JobKeeper have been accused of paying CEOs hefty bonuses. Andrew Barkla is estimated to be the highest paid CEO in the country, earning $37 million last financial year. His company, IDP Education, has awarded him a bonus of $683,000, whilst receiving $4.4 million from the federal government to subsidise workers' wages. Accent Group, the company behind Athlete's Foot and Dr. Martens, received $13 million from JobKeeper, and its CEO, Daniel Agostinelli, earned a $1.2 million bonus. The Star Entertainment Group benefited from $64.8 million of JobKeeper. Its CEO received an $830,000 bonus. Ferry operator Sealink was paid more than $8 million of JobKeeper. Its CEO was awarded a bonus of $504,000. And Australia's winemakers have been hit by a second Chinese government probe as trade tensions between the countries escalate. China has started an anti-subsidy investigation into wines in containers holding 2 litres or less from Australia, according to a statement on the Ministry of Commerce website. The announcement comes less than 2 weeks after China, the biggest international buyer of Australian wine, said it had started an anti-dumping probe into the same product. The investigation is the latest blow to the Australian industry, which has been hit by slower demand amid global COVID-19 lockdowns, drought-affected vintages, as well as smoke taint and damage from the country's unprecedented bushfire season last summer. China also slapped a ban on Australia's biggest grain exporter, a cooperative with about 4,000 farmer members, after claims customs authorities found pests in a shipment of barley. China Customs suspended barley imports from CBH, based in Western Australia and run by former BHP iron ore boss Jimmy Wilson. The latest Chinese sanctions sent shockwaves to the Australian grain-growing community as it gears up for what is said to be the best harvest in several years in many regions. And the Future Fund has felt the pain of collapsing share prices and asset values sparked by the COVID-19 pandemic, delivering a return of negative 0.9% for fiscal 2020, as it reported a slight decline in assets over the financial year to $161 billion. However, the nation's sovereign wealth fund says despite the fall, its 10-year return of 9.2% per annum exceeds its benchmark target of 6.1% per year. The target return for 2020 was a positive 3.7%. Handing down its result, the Future Fund said it had rebalanced its portfolio to a neutral stance in the face of volatility and uncertainty in the global economy, and also reduced its risk appetite in its private equity portfolio. And QBE Chief Executive Pat Regan has departed suddenly after an independent investigation into a complaint by a female employee found it breached the company's code of ethics and conduct. No details were provided of the breach, but the company said an external investigation had examined workplace communications that the board concluded did not meet the standards set out in the group's code of ethics and conduct. Mr. Regan's departure comes a week after sexual harassment allegations at AMP led to the demotion of the accused AMP Capital boss Bo Pahari and the resignation of Chairman David Murray. At the end of the reporting season for Australia's publicly listed companies, it's cleared COVID-19 has been a payday for some, but destructive for others. A quarter of ASX 200 companies reported a loss for 2019-20 financial year. Full-year earnings were down 38% and dividends down 36%. Some retailers and mining stocks saw strong profit growth. Travel stocks fared worse. Analysis by CommSec reveals 75% of companies reported statutory net profit of 2019-20, well below the 10-year average of 90% of companies reported an annual profit. It is the weakest outcome in the decade we've been tracking interim and final reports with an end June or December financial year, said CommSec's chief economist Craig James. And that's it for this week. And next week I'll be talking to John Milionis. head of Channel APJ, who will talk about his company's survey showing how companies are finding remote work challenging, and he'll be giving advice on how to manage it. And I'll be talking to CommSec Chief Economist Craig James about the market in the week ahead. In the meantime, you can find me on Twitter at TalkingBizBRZZ, on Facebook and on LinkedIn. And if you want, leave a comment. Wishing you all a safe and healthy week.